Spring, the year 2000. A Belgian demographer steps off a ferry onto the eastern coast of an island, carrying a suitcase, a notebook, and a blue pen. His name is Michel Poulain. He has not come as a tourist. He has come to prove that an entire population is lying about its age. The previous autumn, at a conference in Montpellier, a Sardinian doctor named Gianni Pez had stood in front of some of the most respected demographers in the world and told them something they did not believe. In a cluster of mountain villages on his home island, he said, men were reaching 100 at a rate no one had ever documented. Not women, men. Everywhere on Earth, women outlive men at the far end of life. They do it by a wide margin. For every man who reaches 100, roughly 5 women do. That ratio holds in Japan, it holds in Sweden, it holds in every data set anyone has ever assembled. Pez was claiming that in his mountains it was close to 1-to-1. The room did not applaud. One of the most eminent demographers present suggested in front of everyone that the data were false, that the centenarians were false, that somewhere in the paperwork of a poor rural province, ages had been inflated, records muddled, and a country doctor had mistaken bad bookkeeping for a discovery. Over the coffee break, they settled on a solution. Send someone who could not be fooled. Poulain was that someone. He spent 6 months on the island. He worked through roughly 40 municipalities. He went into parish archives and town halls and pulled baptismal registers written in ink that predated the unification of Italy. He cross-checked every claimed birth against marriage records, death records, military rolls, and the ages of siblings. Every time a claim survived, he made a mark on the map. The marks did not scatter. They clustered, tightly, stubbornly, over a band of granite and limestone in the island's mountainous east. By the end of it, he had failed. He had not found a single falsified centenarian. He had found the opposite, and he had drawn, without intending to, the first blue zone on Earth, named for nothing more than the color of the pen in his hand. 26 years later, that circle of ink is the most studied ground in longevity science. Diets are sold on it. Film crews arrive every summer. Almost none of what the world took from that map is what the map actually said, because the ink did not settle on the beaches. This is Sardinia. It is the second largest island in the Mediterranean, and it does not behave like an island. Nearly a fifth of it stands above 600 meters. The interior is granite and limestone, folded into ridges that run for 100 kilometers without a straight road in them. Snow closes the high passes most winters. The coast is what the world knows: turquoise shallows, white sand, photographs. The coast is also the part of the island Sardinians spent 2,000 years avoiding. The blue circle sits inland. It covers a cluster of villages in Ogliastra and the southern Barbagia: Villagrande Strisaili, Talana, Arzana, Urzulei, Seulo. Most of them sit between 600 and 900 meters. Most hold fewer than 1,500 people. None of them has a beach. In Villagrande Strisaili, the probability of reaching 100 was found to be roughly double the rate for the rest of Sardinia. And Sardinia was already an outlier for all of Europe. The question that has occupied researchers for a quarter of a century is not really why Sardinians live long. Plenty of Mediterranean populations live long. It is why the men do. So start with a day. A shepherd in Ogliastra leaves before light. His flock is not in a barn. It is scattered across communal grazing on a slope, and the slope is the point. Studies of shepherds in this region measured an average daily walking distance of around 12.5 kilometres across ground with an average gradient of about 15%. 15% is not a hill. It is a staircase made of loose rock, and he covers it twice a day, in every season for 60 years. Sardinians in these villages aged 90 and above were recorded averaging more than 12,000 steps a day, not in a study group, in their ordinary lives. That is the mechanism, and it is almost aggressively unglamorous. Moderate intensity load applied at gradient without interruption across an entire adult lifetime. Cardiologists working in the region have noted that resting heart rates and cardiovascular profiles among men in their 70s and 80s here look closer to those of much younger populations elsewhere in Europe. The body does not know it is exercising, it only knows the sheep are up the mountain. The food is equally unremarkable. Barley bread, thin and dried, which keeps for weeks in a saddlebag. Fava beans, chickpeas, wild greens gathered from the roadside, a soup thickened with beans and fennel, pecorino from his own animals, a small glass of cannonau, a red made from Grenache grapes grown at altitude, unusually heavy in polyphenols. Meat appears on Sundays and feast days, not daily. Across the traditional diet of these households, meat accounted for roughly 5% of intake, against 10 to 16% in most of Europe and North America. And almost no fish. On an island, surrounded by one of the richest seas in the Mediterranean. The mountain villages had no road to the coast worth using, and the coast had something worse than distance waiting on it. We will come back to that. Then, there is the blood itself. Sardinia is a genetic island as much as a geographic one. The men of the Ogliastra carry a paternal lineage, a Y chromosome marker known as M26, that is common here and close to absent across the rest of Europe. It has been passed father to son, essentially unaltered, for thousands of generations, because for thousands of years almost nobody arrived and almost nobody left. Among Sardinian centenarians, researchers have found lower frequencies of the gene variant most strongly associated with Alzheimer's disease and cardiovascular risk. But genetics is the part everyone wants to be the answer, because genetics absolves you. If it is in the blood, there is nothing to do but admire it. The researchers who built the map do not think it is mostly the blood. They think it is the walking, the eating, and one more thing that is far harder to bottle. We will get to that too, in a village where 4 men still sing in a circle with their arms around each other's shoulders. Above the tree line, on the ridges where the flocks graze in summer, there is another kind of sheep entirely. The mouflon is short-coated and rust-brown, with horns that curl back on themselves like coiled rope. It is the ancestral silhouette, the shape a sheep has before 10,000 years of human breeding softens it. And it is not truly wild. Genetic work indicates the Mediterranean mouflon descends from some of the earliest domestic sheep in the world, brought to these islands by Neolithic farmers and then abandoned, or escaped, or simply left behind when a settlement failed. They went back to the mountain. They have been up there ever since. A mouflon ram can navigate a rock face that would strand a domestic ewe in minutes. It carries no wool worth shearing and gives no milk anyone can collect. Everything that made it useful has been shed. Herders and mouflons have shared the same ridges in the Gennargentu for 4,000 years. One flock kept, one flock released, both of them still climbing the same rock at dawn. To understand why anyone chose to live up here, you have to go down. Cagliari sits at the southern edge of the island, wrapped around a hill of pale limestone, looking out across a shallow gulf. Behind the city lies the Campidano, the one genuinely wide, genuinely flat, genuinely fertile plain on Sardinia. Good soil, good water, a natural harbour. On the lagoons at the city's edge, flamingos stand in water a few centimetres deep. Thousands of them, close enough to the runway that aircraft climb through pink. By every ordinary logic of settlement, this should have been where the population concentrated and the culture centred. Instead, for most of 2,000 years, the low ground was where you went to die. The lagoons and the standing water of the plain were breeding grounds for Anopheles labranchii, one of the most effective malaria vectors in the Mediterranean basin. Malaria was endemic in Sardinia from antiquity, not seasonal, not occasional, structural. The consequences shaped everything above it. Families moved uphill, out of the mosquito's range, and built where the water ran fast and cold. The high villages were not chosen for their views. They were chosen because the fever could not climb. Fields were worked at altitude, which meant terraces, which meant walking. Herding suited the terrain better than farming, which meant the food economy tilted towards sheep, barley and beans, rather than grain and fish. The sea was left to the fever and the raiders, so the island turned inward and stopped looking at its own coastline. And the disease did not only redraw the map, it rewrote the genome. Malaria applies brutal selective pressure. Any inherited quirk of the red blood cell that makes life harder for the parasite gets passed on, even when it carries costs of its own. In Sardinia, two of them became common. The first is beta thalassemia, a blood disorder that, in its severe form, requires lifelong transfusion. By the late 1970s, roughly one Sardinian newborn in 300 was born with the major form. The second is a deficiency of an enzyme called G6PD. In some districts, it affects well over 1 man in 10. It is usually silent until the person eats broad beans or takes certain drugs, and their red blood cells begin to break apart. Sardinia paid for its resistance in children. Then, in 1946, someone tried to end it. The Rockefeller Foundation, working with the Italian government and post-war relief funds, established a regional agency with a single purpose: not to control the mosquito, but to eliminate the species from the island entirely. Sardinia was chosen because it was isolated, heavily infected, and, in the language of the project documents, a laboratory. Over 5 years, the island was divided into sectors of roughly 7 square kilometres each and worked through methodically. 267 metric tons of DDT were spread across Sardinia. Squads of sprayers walked the marshes and the stream beds and the cattle sheds. In the villages, people wrote verses to them on rocks and house walls. The campaign failed at its stated goal. Anopheles labranchii was never eradicated. It is on the island today. But malaria transmissions stopped, and it has not returned. What that meant in one generation was that the low ground opened. The coast became habitable. The fever that had held Sardinians in the mountains for 2 millennia was gone within the lifetime of people who are now being studied for having lived a very long time. Which raises a question nobody was asking in 1951. If the mosquito made these villages, what happens to them once it is gone? And the mosquito was not finished with them. What it wrote into Sardinian blood is still being read in a hospital ward 300 kilometres north of here. Drive north from the Campidano and the ground begins to rise into low, volcanic tablelands. On one of them, near the village of Baramini, sits a tower of dark basalt with 3 stories inside it and a corbelled dome overhead, ringed by 4 more towers and the crushed remains of a village. It is called Su Nuraxi. It is one of roughly 7,000. 7,000. Across an island the size of Wales, built from stones weighing several tons apiece, raised without mortar, most of them in the 2nd millennium before Christ. Some estimates put the original number far higher. Many were quarried away over the centuries to build walls and churches. Nothing else in Europe compares in density. The people who built them are called Nuragic for the towers, because we do not know what they called themselves. They left no writing, none. No inscriptions, no tablets, no scratched merchant's tally. A civilization that worked bronze with real sophistication, traded across the Mediterranean, engineered domes that have stood for 3,500 years, and did not, as far as anyone has ever found, write anything down. So the towers are the record, and the towers do not explain themselves.
Were they fortresses?
Some sit on high ground with commanding sightlines and would make excellent ones. Others sit in valleys where they command nothing at all. Were they temples, chieftains' halls, grain stores, territorial markers between clans? The honest answer is that all of these have been argued by serious people, and none has won. What can be said is that they were built by communities small enough to know one another and organized enough to move rock on that scale, over centuries, without any evident central state issuing orders. And then, one by one, they stopped being used. The last of them were abandoned as the island's population reorganized itself around the coast and the trade that came with it. 7,000 towers, every single one of them empty. It is not the last time this island will empty out a landscape it spent generations building. Spring 1974. On the flat western coast, on the Sinis Peninsula, near the town of Cabras, farmers are ploughing a field. The plough strikes stone. They stop, expecting a rock. It is a head. Limestone, carved roughly life-size, with a face unlike anything in the Western Mediterranean. A T-shaped ridge for brow and nose, and 2 perfect concentric circles for eyes. Over the following decades, archaeologists take thousands of fragments out of that field. Assembled, they resolve into something close to 40 statues, standing between 2 and 2.5 meters tall. Archers with bows held across the chest, boxers with shields raised over their heads, warriors in horned helmets. They are Nuragic, carved somewhere around the 9th and 8th centuries before Christ, which makes them the oldest monumental human sculpture in the Western Mediterranean. Older than the Greek kouroi they superficially resemble, made by a people who left no name. Beneath them lay a necropolis, rows of cylindrical tombs cut into the ground, covered with sandstone slabs, holding the remains of young men buried sitting and kneeling. The giants had been standing over their dead. And every one of them had been broken, not weathered, not collapsed, smashed, systematically into thousands of pieces and left in the ground where they fell. Someone came to that field and destroyed an entire generation of monuments deliberately. Nobody knows who. Rival neuralgic communities have been proposed, Phoenician settlers, Carthaginian armies, an internal reckoning of some kind that left no other trace. The statues cannot say. Neither can the people who carved them. It took 40 years and a great deal of patient work to put around 25 of them back together. They stand now in museums in Cagliari and Cabras, reassembled from fragments, seams visible. Which is its own kind of answer. Something can be broken and still, eventually, be read. The danger is not being broken. The danger is never having been written down at all. In late spring, on the scrubland below those ridges, giant fennel comes into flower. Thick, hollow stalks 2 or 3 meters high, topped with wide, yellow umbels. Among them flies a butterfly found in only 2 places on Earth. The Corsican swallowtail is pale yellow, banded in black, with short, blunt tails on the hind wings, a subtle difference from its widespread cousin that took entomologists a long time to accept as a species. It lives on Sardinia and on Corsica and nowhere else. Its caterpillars feed on that fennel, and giant fennel is a plant that can sicken and kill sheep. So there is a small, specific arrangement happening on these slopes that almost nobody sees. The shepherd steers his flock away from the fennel because it is poison to them. The caterpillar eats it, sequestered inside a food source no grazing animal will strip. A butterfly whose entire range is 2 islands survives on the one plant the island's dominant industry has to avoid. It is protected under European law now, and it needs the protection. The scrub it depends on is squeezed between fire, development, and abandonment. But it is here every summer, on the same slopes, doing the same thing it has done since these were 2 mountains attached to a continent. North and east of the towers, the ground stops rising gently and starts rising in earnest. This is Barbagia, and the name is not local. It is Roman. The legions took Sardinia from Carthage in the 3rd century before Christ, held the plains, worked the mines, shipped the grain, and never established meaningful control over the interior. So, they named it for what they thought it contained: Barbaria, the land of barbarians. 2,000 years later, the interior is where the island's oldest things survive. Start with the language. Sardinian is not an Italian dialect. It is a separate Romance language, and by the measure linguists have applied most often, it is the most conservative one alive, closer in sound, structure, and vocabulary to spoken Latin than French, Spanish, Romanian, or Italian. Speakers still say things a Roman would broadly recognize. There are over 1 million people with some command of it. UNESCO classifies it as definitely endangered, not because it is unloved. It is on road signs, in poetry, in political slogans, in music, but because the number of children learning it at home has fallen far enough that the arithmetic no longer works. The language that outlasted the Roman Empire is being outlasted by television. Then there is the singing. Canto a tenore is performed by 4 men. They stand in a tight circle, facing inward, close enough to touch. One voice carries the words, a poem, often improvised, often about a place or a grievance or a woman. The other 3 build a sound underneath it that most people hearing it for the first time assume is being produced by an instrument. It is not. The 2 lowest voices, called subassu and sacontra, are sung with a guttural, buzzing timbre deep in the throat that turns the human voice into something closer to a drone. The tradition holds that the voices imitate what a shepherd hears alone. The bass is the ox, the contra is the sheep, the middle voice is the wind. It was inscribed by UNESCO in 2005 as intangible heritage of humanity. It is taught in Biti, in Orgosolo, in Oliena, in Mamoiada, and you are more likely to hear it properly in a village bar in November than in any concert hall. And in Mamoiada, in the days after the winter solstice, men put on masks. The Mamuthones wear black sheepskin, a carved wooden face darkened almost to soot, and 30 kilograms of bronze cowbells strapped across the back. They move in 2 files, shoulders forward, and every few steps they jolt their bodies in unison so the bells crash together at once. They are herded through the street by the isojadores, who wear red and carry a rope, and who throw it over people in the crowd. What it means is contested. A hunt, a herd, a conquered people driven through a town by their conquerors. A right for the earth at the turn of the year. Every explanation is a guess laid over something older than the guess. Nobody in Mamoiada is confused about whether to keep doing it. This is the interior that produced the numbers on Poulin's map. And here is the part the wellness industry has never known what to do with. In these villages, an old man does not stop being a man with a role. He is not moved to a facility in the provincial capital. He sits in the center of the table, not at the edge of it. He is asked things. His judgment is solicited on matters that actually get decided. He walks to the bar in the evening and drinks a glass the size of a shot, bought for him by someone who expects one bought back. Researchers who built the Blue Zone concept came to regard this as a factor in its own right. Not a pleasant side effect of longevity, but part of the machinery producing it. Continuous social role, daily shared meals, an old man with somewhere he is required to be. That is the answer to why the men, and not just the women. Everywhere else, retirement removes a man from the structure that gave him purpose, and the removal is measurable in his body. Here, there was no retirement. There was a flock, and it needed him until the day he could no longer get up the slope. And yet, this same interior, within living memory, kept a woman whose job was to decide when a life had gone on long enough. She was called the acabadora. The word comes from the Spanish acabar, to finish. She was summoned by the family of someone dying in prolonged agony, in villages days from a doctor where nothing existed that could ease pain. She came at night, dressed in black. The family left the room. She was often the same woman who delivered the village's babies. The instrument that survives is a hammer of weathered olive wood, about 42 centimeters long, held in a small museum in the village of Luras. The documented cases are few and disputed. One in Luras in 1929 involving a man of 70, one reported in Orgosolo in 1952. Some anthropologists argue she was largely a figure the villagers told themselves about, a way of holding in a single image the community's responsibility for its own dying. Others point at the hammer. Either way, the fact underneath is not in dispute. On the island where people live longest, in the villages where they live longest, death at home was something the community handled itself, without institutions, without euphemism, and without pretending it was not happening. That is worth holding on to. It comes back at the end. Behind the villages of the Barbagia, the island lifts into its spine. The Gennargentu is not high by continental standards. Punta la Marmora, the summit, reaches 1,834 meters. But it rises from sea level in under 30 kilometers, and the rock it rises through is a mixture of granite and Paleozoic limestone that water has been dismantling for a very long time. The result is the Supramonte, a plateau of white limestone cut by gorges, scattered with holm oak and hollowed underneath. The Gola su Goropu is a slot between vertical walls that reach 400 meters, narrowing in places to 4 meters across. At noon, the light arrives as a strip. Below it, the rock is full of water. Sardinia holds some of the longest and deepest cave systems in Italy, carved by rivers that run entirely underground and surface only where the limestone gives out. And in those caves, live animals that have never needed eyes. There are 6 species of cave salamander on this island, found nowhere else on Earth. Pale, slender, slow. Animals that spend their entire lives in the dark, on a metabolism so frugal that some can go months without eating. Each one is confined to its own massif. The Supramonte has its own. Monte Albo has its own. Sarabas has its own. Each population was sealed inside its mountain when the surface dried, and each has been evolving separately ever since, in absolute darkness, for a period measured in millions of years. It is easy to look at all of this and file it under wilderness, empty land, untouched. That is the wrong reading, and it matters. Almost every meter of the Supramonte has been walked, named, and used. The gorges have shepherd names, the caves were sheep pens and stores, and during the worst years, hiding places. There are stone huts on the plateau, pinettas, conical, thatched with juniper, built by men who slept out with the flock for months at a stretch and came down for feast days. What looks like emptiness is a landscape whose workforce left. The knowledge of it is held now by men in their 80s who learned it from men who are dead, and by very few people under 40. The mountain has not been abandoned by history. It has been abandoned recently, and by the young. Above the western cliffs near the town of Bosa, something enormous rides the updrafts along the coast road. The griffon vulture has a wingspan approaching 2.5 meters and almost never flaps. It reads the thermal columns rising off the heated rock and works the coast in long, unhurried arcs, sometimes for hours, looking down. Its entire existence on this island was built on the shepherds. Extensive grazing means animals die on open ground, from age, from falls, from weather, and are left where they fall. For thousands of years, that produced a steady, dispersed supply of carrion across the Sardinian uplands, and the griffon colonies were calibrated to it exactly. Then 2 things changed. Poisoned baits, laid out for foxes and feral dogs, moved up the food chain into the birds that cleaned up afterwards. And hygiene regulations required fallen livestock to be collected and removed. The vultures were starved by paperwork and killed by bait meant for something else. Sardinian numbers fell to a few dozen pairs. What brought them back was equally unglamorous: supplementary feeding stations, anti-poison patrols with detection dogs, and a slow renegotiation with farmers about what could be left on the ground. Birds were brought in from Spain to widen the gene pool. The colony on the Bosa coast has climbed back to a scale that means something. The vulture is the clearest indicator on the island of whether traditional pastoralism is functioning. When shepherds work the high ground the old way, the vultures eat. When the flocks come down for good, the sky empties. They are, in the most literal sense, watching the shepherds. The 11th of September, 1354. A fleet under Pedro IV of Aragon lands on the northwestern coast and lays siege to a walled port called Alghero. The town has already rebelled against Catalan rule once and been forgiven. It will not be forgiven twice. When the siege ends, the Aragonese do not simply install a garrison. They empty the town. The Sardinian and Ligurian population is expelled, and settlers are brought in from Catalonia to replace them, wholesale, a colony planted by substitution. 670 years later, the street signs in Alghero are in two languages, not Italian and Sardinian, Italian and Catalan. The old town is a grid of narrow lanes inside honey-colored sea walls, with palm trees on the ramparts and a bell tower that would look entirely at home in Girona. Several thousand people here speak Alguerès, a Catalan variety that has been separated from Barcelona for 6 centuries and has drifted accordingly. They call the town l'Alguer. Catalan visitors describe hearing their own language spoken in a way their grandparents would have recognized, and they do not. A deportation carried out in the 14th century is now a cultural asset with a festival attached. That is what time does to atrocity given long enough. It files it under heritage. The people who were removed from Alghero left no comparable monument. Their descendants are simply somewhere else on the island, indistinguishable 7 centuries on. South of Alghero, past the sandstone stacks and the lagoons, sits the flat green country of the Barbagia. In the 14th century, this was one of 4 independent Sardinian kingdoms, the Judicates, and it was the last one standing against Aragon. Its ruler from 1383 was a woman. Eleonora of Barbagia inherited a war she did not start and fought it for 2 decades. She was, by every account that survives, extremely good at it. But the reason her name is spoken in Sardinian schools has nothing to do with battles. In 1392, she promulgated the Carta de Logu, a code of law written in Sardinian covering criminal procedure, property, agriculture, inheritance, and the rights of women, in language that ordinary people could understand. It was not a charter of privileges for nobles. It set penalties for arson and for damaging another man's crops. It regulated the fencing of fields. It gave a woman the right to refuse a marriage arranged for her, and penalties for those who forced one. It remained the law of Sardinia for 435 years, surviving the kingdom that produced it, the Aragonese, the Spanish, and the Austrians, and finally repealed only in 1827. And inside it, among the clauses on fields and fences, was a provision protecting the nests of hunting falcons from disturbance. Which is why, when European naturalists came to classify a falcon that breeds on the sea cliffs of these islands, they gave it her name. Eleonora's falcon is slender, dark, and fast, and it does something no other European raptor does. It breeds late, laying eggs in late July and August, when every other bird of prey on the continent has fledged its young and is finished for the year.
The reason is
That its chicks are not fed on the local wildlife. They are fed on migration. From late August through October, hundreds of millions of small songbirds cross the Mediterranean southward, heading for Africa, and they cross where the islands are. Eleonora's falcons nest in colonies on the cliffs directly beneath that river of birds, and time the hungriest weeks of their chicks' lives to coincide with it precisely. They have been observed hunting cooperatively over open water, spacing themselves into a line to intercept birds coming in off the sea. A bird that rearranged its entire breeding calendar around somebody else's journey. Named, 600 years after the fact, for a woman who wrote its protection into a law about fences. And then there is the part of this island the world actually knows. In 1962, A consortium of investors led by a young Aga Khan bought a stretch of granite coastline in the northeast that local shepherds had regarded as almost worthless, too rocky to farm, too exposed to build on, good for goats. They named it the Costa Smeralda. Within a decade, it had architectural controls, a yacht club, a private airport, and a price per square metre that no Sardinian shepherd would ever generate in a lifetime. It is genuinely beautiful, the water is genuinely that colour, and the development was, by the standards of Mediterranean coastal building, unusually restrained. It is also, for most of the world, the entire island. This is worth naming plainly because it distorts everything downstream. Search for Sardinia and you will be shown 40 kilometres of coast that was invented in 1962, on the opposite side of the island from the villages this film is actually about, at an altitude of roughly 0. The Blue Zone is a 2-hour drive inland and about 800 metres up. There is no visitor centre, there is no gate, there is nothing to buy. The place the island is famous for is the place that had the least to do with making Sardinians what they are. That is not a scandal, it is just a fact about attention and where it goes. There is one more inheritance to account for before the map's darkest square, and it is the mosquitoes. The malaria is gone. What malaria selected for is not. Sardinia has, together with Finland, one of the highest incidences of type 1 diabetes in the world, a striking exception to the north-south gradient that holds across the rest of Europe. It also has among the world's highest rates of multiple sclerosis, far above every surrounding Mediterranean population. Roughly 5% of the general population lives with at least one autoimmune disease. The explanation is the same isolation that produced the longevity. A small founder population, thousands of years of limited outside gene flow, and 2 millennia of ferocious selective pressure from a parasite fixed a distinctive set of immune variants in place. The same closed system that let a rare paternal lineage survive intact, let these survive too. It is not a trade the island agreed to. There is no ledger where the extra decades at one end are set against the children diagnosed at 7 at the other. Both are consequences of the same thing, and the same thing is isolation. The island that was left alone got both. Sardinia is full of these separations, small worlds sealed off and left to go their own way. On the basalt plateau of the Giara di Gesturi, a few hundred small horses live loose among the cork oaks, drinking from seasonal ponds. They are not descendants of escaped farm stock. They have been up there since antiquity, and they are the only genuinely wild horse population left in Europe. On the island of Asinara, off the northwest corner, a population of white donkeys with pale eyes grazes ground that until 1998 held a maximum security prison. The men who ran the island were the reason nobody developed it. The donkeys inherited the result. On the Sinis Peninsula, the columns of Tharos stand in the sea shallows. A Phoenician port, then Carthaginian, then Roman, abandoned around the year 1000 when the coast became indefensible. Its stones were carried inland and built into Oristano. The pattern is always the same. Something arrives, takes the coast, and leaves. The interior absorbs the debris and carries on. February 2019. That pattern breaks. Shepherds are standing on the roads of Sardinia, tipping steel canisters onto the tarmac, and thousands of litres of sheep's milk are running down the Camber into the drains. The price has fallen to around 60 cents a litre. It costs more than 70 to produce. The arithmetic underneath is not complicated. Sardinia holds around 12,000 sheep farms and close to 3 million sheep, roughly 40% of all the sheep in Italy. Most of the milk goes into one product, Pecorino Romano, a hard salted cheese, most of it exported, the majority of it to the United States, where a great deal of it ends up grated into supermarket pasta sauces and frozen pizza. The production of that cheese is supposed to be capped by quota to protect the price. The penalties for exceeding the quota were low enough that exceeding it was rational. Overproduction ran for years. The wholesale price of the cheese collapsed, and because the shepherd sits at the very start of a long chain and has no leverage anywhere along it, the collapse arrived at his gate as a number he could not survive. So they poured it out. On the 5th consecutive day of protest, shepherds marched in Nuoro and shopkeepers closed in solidarity. In Rome, they handed pieces of pecorino to passers-by outside Parliament. Ministers came, met delegations, promised solutions. Understand what is being watched here. Not a farm subsidy dispute. This is the economic base that produced the longest-lived men on Earth, being priced out of existence by the export market for grated cheese. The walking, the gradient, the daily roll, the flock that needs you at 81. All of it rests on a man being able to feed his family by keeping sheep on a mountain. Remove that, and the mechanism does not survive as a lifestyle choice. Nobody walks 12 kilometers uphill every day of their life for the wellness benefits. The nuraghi emptied once, and the island survived it. The pinettas emptied a generation ago. The villages inside the blue circle are emptying now, and the people leaving are the ones who would have been walking that slope in 2070. 60 kilometers inland from the eastern coast, at 600 meters, on a road that goes to one place and stops, is a village called Perdastafogu. The name means stones of fire. Fewer than 1,700 people live there. In 2012, 9 of them entered the record books together. The Melis siblings, 3 brothers and 6 sisters, all living, all born in that village, were verified by Guinness World Records with a combined age of 818 years and 205 days. The eldest was Consolata, who turned 105 that August. Then Claudina at 99, Maria at 97, Antonio at 93, Concetta at 91, Adolfo at 89, who was still working in the village bar, Vitalio at 81, Fida at 80, and Mafalda, the baby, at 78. Consolata had 9 children, 24 grandchildren, and 25 great-grandchildren. She lived another 3 years and died at 108, and she was not an outlier in her own street. A demographer at the University of Cagliari calculated that Perdastafogu's rate of centenarians ran at roughly 16 times the Sardinian average, and about 19 times the average for Italy as a whole. Sardinia is the outlier for Europe. Ogliastra is the outlier for Sardinia, and this village, on a dead-end road, is the outlier for Ogliastra. This is where the blue pen ran out of ink. The densest concentration of verified extreme old age ever recorded, in a place with one main street, one church, and no reason for anyone to stop. 26 years of research have gone into asking why. The answers assemble into something almost disappointingly plain: altitude and terrain, which made a lifetime of load unavoidable. A closed gene pool, which fixed both the protective variants and the damaging ones. A diet that was frugal because the land was poor, not because anyone designed it. Family structures that kept 3 generations within shouting distance, and a social contract in which nobody old was ever surplus. And directly beside all of it, sharing a border, sharing a wind, is the Poligono Interforze del Salto di Quirra. It is the largest military testing range in Europe. It has been operating since 1956. Missiles are fired here. Ordnance is destroyed here. Rocket motors are test-burned on static stands. Sardinia, an island of 1.5 million people, hosts roughly 60% of Italy's military ranges. And the land inside the range is not sealed. For decades it was leased for grazing under contract to local shepherds. The sheep went in, the men went in with them. In 2001, shepherds began reporting what they were finding in their flocks. Lambs born with hydrocephalus, goats with tumors, deformities at rates they had never seen in their working lives. Then the pattern was found in people. In one town near the range, in a single year in the late 1980s, a quarter of the children born had some form of birth defect. Investigators examining the shepherd population who worked the rangeland reported that close to 2/3 of them had developed cancer. In the small settlement of Quirra itself, out of fewer than 150 residents, lymphoma and leukemia were recorded as having killed 21 people. It acquired a name, Quirra syndrome. What caused it has never been settled, and it is important to be exact about that. Depleted uranium was the accusation that reached the newspapers. Independent modeling of the dispersion concluded that the quantities of depleted uranium required to produce illness on that scale would have been enormous, far more than anyone credibly claims was used, which does not clear the range. It moves the question. Thorium dust from rocket components, heavy metals, lead, antimony, tungsten, dioxins from open burning of munitions, arsenic, all have been raised as candidates, and the environmental studies have been contested by every party with an interest in the outcome. Prosecutors in Lanusei opened a case. Around 20 people were placed under investigation, including senior officers and a former mayor of Perdas de Fogu, over environmental disaster and the handling of hazardous waste. Former commanders of the site appeared before Italian courts. Nothing about it has produced a clean answer. Families in those villages have buried people they believe were killed by the ground they grazed, and they have not been told definitively that they are right. So, hold the two facts together, because they occupy the same coordinates. The village with the highest verified concentration of centenarians on the planet shares a fence line with a weapons range that its neighbors blame for their children. The same land, the same wind off the same ridge, the same families, in some cases the same households, a grandmother at 105 in the front room, a documented cancer cluster among the men who worked the hill behind the house. There is no reconciliation available. Nobody has one. The longevity is real and verified down to 19th century baptismal ink. The illness cluster is real and documented in medical records. They are not a paradox to be solved. They are two true things sitting on top of each other, which is what places actually look like when you stop editing them. 26 years ago, a demographer marked this ground in blue because the old people here were provably old. That was all the ink ever meant. It was never a promise about what else was in the soil. There is a cave on the eastern coast, below the cliffs at Calagonone, that can only be entered from the water. The Sardinians called it the Grotta del Bue Marino, the cave of the sea ox. The sea ox was the monk seal. They hauled out on those shingle beaches inside the cliff for as long as anyone had been fishing this coast. Neolithic people carved figures on the rock nearby. The cave was named for the animals, which is the surest sign of how ordinary they once were. By the late 20th century, they were gone from Sardinian waters. Hunted, displaced, drowned in nets, squeezed out of every beach a boat could reach. The Mediterranean monk seal became one of the rarest marine mammals on Earth, and the cave kept a name for an animal nobody expected to see again. Then, in recent years, they came back into the record. Confirmed sightings along this coast. A species that had been written off in these waters, moving through the same sea entrance into the same dark. It is not a recovery. A handful of animals is not a population. But the cave is no longer only a memory of them. Some things here survive by being written down. Some survive by being repeated. Some survive by being too far up the mountain to be worth taking.
In the village of Louras,
The same village that keeps the Acabadora's hammer in a glass case, there is a wild olive tree in a hollow beside a lake. It is estimated at somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years old. It was standing when the giants were carved at Monte Prama, and when they were smashed, and it did not record either event. The giants did. That is the difference. Broken into thousands of pieces, buried in a field, ploughed over for 28 centuries, and still, in the end, readable. 40 years of patient work put 25 of them back on their feet. The Nuragic people wrote nothing, and so we have their towers and none of their reasons. 7,000 structures and not one sentence. Which is what makes the men and women in these villages worth listening to now, and not in a decade. The last people raised entirely inside the system that produced these numbers are in their 80s and 90s. They learned the mountain from men who are dead. They speak a language their grandchildren are losing. They worked a trade that in 2019 could not clear its own costs. Whatever it was that made this place, and the honest answer is that it was several ordinary things applied without interruption for 80 years. It was never a philosophy. It was a set of conditions: poverty, altitude, isolation, and an old man who was still needed on a Tuesday. Most of those conditions have already been dismantled, not maliciously, by roads, by markets, by medicine that saves children the fever used to take, by every improvement anybody in these villages would have prayed for. And there is one more thing the Acabadora understood that has quietly gone with the rest of it. In her villages, the dying happened in a room the family stood outside of, in a house on a street they knew. It was terrible, and it was theirs. Today, the very old of the Barbagia are far more likely to die in a hospital in Cagliari, 2 hours from the ridge, among strangers doing their best. Living to 105 is not the same as living to 105 here. So the question left on the table is not what the secret is. There is no secret. It has been measured, published, and argued over for 26 years. The question is whether a place can keep producing the longest lives in Europe once it has stopped being the kind of place that produced them. Nobody in Ogliastra knows. The men who could tell you are the last ones who lived it. Thank you for spending this time on the island with us. Until the next journey,